Hi, welcome back to the Alex and Dom Show. I'm Alex, and today we have a little bit of sad news. Dom will not be hosting with me any longer. He's moved on to a producer role and script writing. He decided to step away from the show for personal reasons, and he has wrote us a script, and he wants to continue to write scripts and be a producer. So I'm happy for him, and I think you should be too, because he's found his love, his passion for script writing and producing, and everyone connected to the show, connected to Artemis Studios, is just extremely excited and happy with the direction that everyone's going in. And like I said, the show will always be called Alex and Dom Show from now on. He's still an integral part of the show. He might pop on here and there, but I'm so excited for his journey and to see where it's going to go. He wrote us this script today, which for me, I feel like it's one of the best that we've had on the show. Trey will still be with the show. We'll have a couple guest stars here and there. So, let's move forward. Let's look to the future. The future is bright for the Alex and Dom Show. I will continue to do the show probably until I die. But if you want to check out some other shows as well with Artemis Studios, our parent company, there's Experience the Bazaar, Real or Ruse, My Son and Me, and a couple others that are great, so we really appreciate them for giving us a voice to speak to you guys. So yeah, that's been what's going on, and that's why it's taken us so long to put out the next episode. But without further ado, today's episode. They were brilliant. They were young. They were privileged beyond measure. They were, by all outward appearances, everything a 1920s American family might have hoped their son would become. Poised, educated, fluent in languages of high culture and social success. But beneath depressed collars and the practiced smiles, two minds conspired to answer a single, terrible question. Could a man commit a crime so flawless, so cleverly designed, that no judge, no jury, no law could touch him? The question became an experiment. The experiment became a murder. The murder became a national obsession. This is the story of Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb, of how fantasy of superiority hardened into a plan, how a boy named Bobby Franks was taken from his street in Chicago, and how what two young men thought would be the perfect crime cracked and shattered into a spectacle that would haunt America for decades. Part 1. The Men and the Myth. Picture Chicago, 1924. A city of contradictions, a roaring, bustling metropolis where new wealth rubbed shoulders with an old money world. Jazz and speakeasies hummed into the shadows, while universities and social clubs polished the city's more respectable face. In that world lived two boys who were at once ordinary and not. Nathan Leopold was 19, small, pale, hyper-intelligent, a child prodigy cataloged by schools and professors, fluent in several languages, obsessed with bird-watching and exacting cataloging. Nathan loved books and ideas the way other boys loved baseball and radios. He read Nietzsche and misread him. He came to believe, as we'll see, that study and intellect could place a man beyond ordinary moral rules. Richard Loeb was 18, handsome, athletic, with an easy charm, he could be so magnetic in a room. Where Nathan was bookish, Richard seemed to embody freedom. He liked to flirt with danger, to gamble with his own boundaries. He graduated early from college. He had money. He had the instinct, the taste for risk. When they met in their teens, each completed what the other lacked. Nathan's intellect fed Richard's appetite for daring. Richard's daring tended toward cruelty when left unmoored. They became inseparable. Two minds finding in each other a mirror and an accelerator. Friends would later describe the relationship as intense, conspiratorial, a friendship that both idolized and reinforced the worst impulses of each partner. They began with small transgressions, petty crimes, pranks, thefts taken more for the thrill of the act than a material gain. But the thrills dulled fast. They needed something grander, a proof of their superiority, an act that would stand as a demonstration that rules were meant for men like them, and their ideas found dangerous philosophical fuel. Nathan read Nietzsche and took to the darker idea of the Übermensch, the Superman who creates his own values and stands above conventional morality. In private conversations, they pondered the idea of deciding who was worthy to live and who was not. That thought, so toxic and pretended to be so clever, became the seedbed for a plan. They would commit a murder, not out of hatred, not for money or not for revenge, but to see if they could do it with the cold, surgical precision of an intellectual thought experiment. They would do it with planning, with the removal of all obvious motive, and then they would watch the world fail to catch them. In other words, they would prove that they could be above the law simply by being smarter than everyone else. The phrase, perfect crime, was not a journalistic invention here. It was an aspiration. Part 2. Choosing a victim. Perfection demands calculation. For months they searched for someone who would be incidentally connected, enough to be accessible, but not so connected that their disappearance would set off immediate alarms that the boys couldn't control. They studied routines, watched schoolyards, and discussed options with terrifying coolness. They settled on Robert Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old boy who lived in the neighborhood. He was not an enemy. He was not even disliked. He was, by all accounts, a typical Midwest boy. Bright, athletic, a familiar face in the streets where these two men lived. Bobby was also a second cousin of Richard Loeb, an intimate, mundane connection that made the act possible and the aftermath bearable to plan. He would be convenient, accessible. He would not be so well guarded that the abduction would be impossible. He would be a boy who trusted other boys, who might accept a ride. In that trust would be the fatal opening that the two men needed. They did not choose out of malice toward Bobby. They chose because he fit the parameters of an experiment, of a demonstration. To the pair, the boy was a subject. To the world, he would be a child whose life was cut short on a spring afternoon. Part 3. The Kidnapping. On May 21st, 1924, the plan moved from a theory to action. A car had been rented under an alias. The boys picked a day when Bobby would be walking home from school. They called him over with a familiar pretense, a conversation about a tennis racket, a domestic, banal ruse. It was a normal interaction at the corner of a Kenwood Street. A boy approached. An older teen offered a ride, the world carrying on it as it always had. Inside the car, the scene becomes a blur of conflicting accounts. Memory is a slippery thing, but the outline is clear enough. Bobby entered that vehicle. One account places Nathan behind the wheel, Richard in the back. Another says the reverse. What is certain and chilling is the suddenness of the violence. Richard struck Bobby in the head with a blunt end of a chisel. The blows were meant to incapacitate him. He was gagged, bundled into the back seat, and the car drove south, away from the bright neighborhoods toward the less frequented industrial edges of the city. That evening, they dumped Bobby's body in a culvert near Wolf Lake, away from the city center, out of a casual sight, to obscure identification and to attempt to throw the investigators off the scent. They took grisly measures. They removed the boy's clothes, and in a grim detail that drew particular attention at the time, applied hydrochloric acid to the parts of the boy to alter distinguishing features. It was a barbaric attempt, a calculated cruelty meant to reduce the chance of recognition. It is a mark of moral blindness, as insistence that the procedure could erase humanity. The next morning, when the Franks family did not see Bobby return, alarm spread. A ransom note was found, part of the boy's plan to misdirect authorities and buy time, to make the crime seem like a common kidnapping for money, rather than a demonstration of intellectual superiority. They had rehearsed the steps, instructions, drops, a chain of directions to confuse those who would try to trace them. But even the most elaborate plans could fail on small human details, and this one did. The first set of instructions stalled almost immediately because the family failed to meet the convoluted expectations the boys had laid out. The ransom scheme would not bear the weight of the actual world, where panic and confusion are not choreographed, and by the afternoon, when the body was discovered, their ransom theater collapsed into a raw horror of murder. Part 4. A mistake, a glass frame, the thread that unravels genius. If there's a single moment in this case that had been told and retold as proof that arrogance invites downfall, it is the glasses. In the staccato logic of their planning, the boys underestimated the ordinary ways in which the world solves problems, with small human evidence, with gestures that leave a trace. A pair of eyeglasses were found near the body. No ordinary frames, specially made, distinctive in a way that could be traced. The makings on the case, the style, the description, small. The prescription, everything, mundane details that would tie the man to the place. Nathan Leopold wore such glasses. They were not unusual. Nathan had a particular uncommon eyelid condition that made his blinking distinctive in photographs. Portraits of Nathan, the glasses on his face, were matched by neighbors and acquaintances. The glasses provided an angle into the boy's world no amount of theory could outrun. It rooted him to the culprit. It is crucial to hear what the mistake means in human terms. These were not opera house specialists or detectives. They were adolescents whose fantasies made them sloppy. All their papers and rehearsed plans could not erase an object dropped in haste. The glory they sought required not just intelligence, it required hubris, without the humility that might have warned them against leaving a trail. A lens, a hinge, a scratch on the frame. Such things are forgiving to the hunter who learns to read them. The police read, and the reading was swift. When the glasses were traced, they led to Nathan. Investigators began to narrow their focus. a car rental record with an alias, a description of a car in the vicinity of the day of the murder, conversations that were heard or described by friends, these threads braided a rope fast enough to pull the young men into custody. Within days, both Nathan Leopold and Richard Loeb was arrested. The experiment that had started with a Nietzschean flourish had ended in a humiliating capture by the very ordinary police. Part 5. The Confession and the Psychology. The confessions that followed were remarkable, not because they were full of righteous repentance, but because they were cold, clinical, and in some moments almost performative. The two men confessed openly, in detail, speaking with the lack of remorse that unsettled a nation hungry for moral clarity. They described the planning, the choice of the victim, the godlike reasoning they had used to justify the experiment. They spoke of reading Nietzsche, of imagining themselves above the laws of human pity. They were not trying to obscure their acts. They seemed at times to be explaining them as if the audience was equals. Their statements were the raw materials of a national conversation. Newspapers printed lines from their confessions. Editors debated whether this was the product of sick minds, corrupted privilege, or the dangerous influence of nihilistic philosophy. For many, it became a morality play. The country, through headlines and editorial pages, demanded explanations that would reinsert social order. The confessions, however, did not resolve those questions. They complicated them. Were these boys monsters, or were they children corrupted by ideas? Were they beyond punishment because they were exceptional, or were they simply criminals whose capacity for planning made them all the more culpable? Into the courtroom and into this moral morass stepped one of the 20th century's most eloquent legal minds, Clarence Darrow. He accepted the case not because he believed in the pair's innocence, but because he believed that the state had no right to take life. Darrow's mission was singular: to keep the death penalty from being imposed. He saw Leopold and Loeb not only as criminals, but as human beings, shaped by psychology, by circumstance, by pathology. He would craft a defense meant to humanize them, to show that even great intellect does not negate mental abnormity of the complex causes of crime. Part 6. The Trial as Spectacle. The courtroom in Cook County became an amphitheater. Reporters filled galleys. Telegraph officers screamed dispatches. The nation leaned in. This was not only a trial of two young men. It was a trial of ideas. Newspapers spoke of the trial of the century, a phrase that would be applied to the other showy cases, but that in 1924 truly fit the bill. The drama was immediate. Two well-bred youths, confessions in hand, and a defense team resolved to avoid execution at all cost. Clarence Darrow made the crucial strategic choice to plead guilty. He could have put the boys before a jury to argue insanity, a path whose theatricality might have turned public opinion into a lynch mob. Instead, Darrow entered pleas of guilty on their behalf. Legally, this transformed the coming proceedings into a sentencing hearing rather than a determination of guilt. The real question now was punishment, life or death. It was a decision that Darrow hoped to influence by arguing not the finitude of their culpability, but the complexity of their humanity. Darrell's speeches in the courtroom are part legal argument, part sermon. He spoke for days to the judge, not to the jury, laying out an extended plea against capital punishment as a moral and rational instrument of justice. He argued the execution would be a brash, final solution applied to the young men, whose minds were warped by forces larger than their wills. He painted a picture of social conditions, psychological immaturity, the intellectual aberration. It was a masterclass in rhetoric. For many, it was also an affront. How could a man who had confessed so plainly be spared the needle? For Darrow, the answer was simple. The law should not descend to the level of revenge. The prosecution, on the other hand, demanded a reassertion of social order. They argued that brilliant backgrounds in speculative philosophies could not excuse the deliberate destruction of an innocent life. They asked the judge to impose the ultimate sanction of the most deliberate of crimes. After 32 days that held the public breathless, the sentence was handed down. The judge spared the death penalty and instead sentenced Leopold and Loeb to life imprisonment plus 99 years. The courtroom exploded, some in relief, some in fury, and Clarence Darrow's campaign against capital punishment was, in this instance, a success. The outcome would be debated for decades, as many would ask whether justice, mercy, or spectacle had won that day. Part 7. The aftermath and the irony of fate. The sentence spared their lives, but it did not spare their fates. Prison was not for them a garden of philosophical reflection. Richard Loeb's story in custody ended violently. In 1936, he was murdered by another inmate. Loeb's death came with its own brutal irony. A life that sought to test invulnerability met an invulnerable human law in the form of a prison hierarchy and violence. Nathan Leopold, meanwhile, served more than 3 decades behind bars. He worked, he studied, and he applied for parole multiple times. In 1958, after 34 years, he was released on parole and moved away from the Midwest, eventually dying in Puerto Rico in 1971. Their lives after the trial became footnotes to the larger story, but people continued to argue about what their conviction and punishment meant about crime, class, and the justice system in America. The class reverberated in culture and art. The case reverberated in culture and art. Authors, playwrights, and filmmakers took up its themes. The arrogance of intellect, the fascination with evil, and the terrifying ease in which ideas, misread, can become a script for action. The Leopold and Loeb story inspired novels and films, and its moral questions remain stubbornly alive. Was this the aberration of a product of corrupted youth and unread philosophy? Or was it the mirror held up to society that breeds entitlement and refuses to attend to the mental and moral education of its children? Part 8. What perfect really meant. We began with the phrase, the perfect murder. In this case, the phrase was part boast, part intellectual conceit. Nathan and Richard wanted a demonstration, a proof that intellect and planning could place a person outside the reach of justice. They gambled that brutality, vocabulary, and rehearsed procedure could outmaneuver human fallibility. But perfection in this story was a mask for hubris. No crime is perfect. Perfection ignores the human elements, the fingerprints of anxiety, the small lapse of attention, the slip of an eyeglass frame on a road trampled by wind and rain. Perfection also ignores the human network of grief and memory that attends every violent death. Bobby Franks was not an idea. He was a child whose life and whose family's sorrow became the real measure of the crime. For the public, the visceral image that remained, the image that made people weep and debate and rage, was less the intellectual conceit that the young body dumped in a cobalt. The small boy who should have had a life. There is, too, a lesson in the legal argument that followed. Clarence Darrow's successful plea against the death penalty, in this case, forced the nation to confront why and when the state should take a life. His rhetoric reshaped public debate for years afterwards, even as many criticized him for defending two young men whose words made them seem so monstrous. The case then sits at an intersection of law and philosophy, of spectacle and accountability of the human heart and the legislative scalpel. It is a case that resists a single moral reading precisely because it asks so many questions about responsibility and remediation. Part 9. The people left behind. Don't let the philosophy and the courtroom eloquence obscure the life whose absence began it all. Bobby Franks was 14. He had a family who loved him, a neighborhood, a youth cut off before he reached his own horizons. For them, it was no experiment, no intellectual curiosity. There was a hole where a son and a cousin and a friend had been. The Franks family's grief was manipulated by boys who cloaked cruelty in the language of theories. The human cost should always be the center of the story, because every legal argument, every philosophical rumination, and every cultural adaptation grows from a human wound that should not be forgotten. The families of the two killers also suffered in complicated ways. Public shame, private regret, financial collapse, spoiled privacy turned into public hatred. Letters and diaries that survived reveal the gnawing of conscience in some corners and denials in others. The community, once safe and polite, learned to live with the knowledge that horror can wear a pressed suit and a finished school pedigree. Part 10. The Long Shadow. Nearly a century later, the Leopold and Loeb case still reads like a parable. It is regularly taught and retold not only for sensational details, but because it raises blunt questions about what prompts violence in modern societies. It forces us to ask whether intelligence as an inoculation against moral failure. And the answer, painfully, is no. It asks whether legal systems can be instruments of retribution or instruments of rehabilitation. And the answer, complicated and unresolved, depends on what society chooses to prioritize at any given time. The case also shows the slow, persistent power of evidence. A pair of glasses, an alias on a rental form, and a misplaced chisel. These small items remind us that truth is often patient. It waits for someone to look closely enough, think clearly enough, and connect the dots that arrogance left behind. We tell the Leopold and Loeb story again and again because it unsettles us. It sits at the crossroads of our worst anxieties. The fear that intellect can be divorced from morality. The fear that the privileged can feel immune to consequence. The fear that cruelty can be wrapped in ideology and made elegant. And yet, even in that chilling elegance, the world insisted on justice. Messy, imperfect human justice, applied by detectives, judges, and ultimately by the rough arithmetic of prison life. This is not a tidy tale. It is an argument with a single conclusion, but it is a reminder that evil, when dressed in theory, still bears the fingerprints of its makers. And that perfect is often just another word for hubris. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the story of the perfect crime, Leopold and Loeb. Now, the perfect crime has been a word thrown around for generations, really, and I'm pretty sure it was around before Leopold and Loeb. the perfect crime has always been a decision made by people who just think they're smarter than the police. You know? They're not. I mean, not, it's not even based on intelligence. It's also based on, you know, you can be the most intelligent and person in the world, and you can plan for everything. But you'll always leave something. You'll always leave a little bit of yourself behind. Because no matter what, you can't account for everything. I mean, there are crimes out there that have not been solved, and that will probably never be solved. But along with those crimes does not make them perfect. It does not make them good crimes. I mean, no crime's a good crime. But it does not make the person more intelligent because they got away with it. Technology, mistakes made by humans help them get away with those crimes. So when you ask yourself, what is a perfect crime? There's no such thing. Truly, there's not. Leopold and Loeb found out that way, the hard way. And Bobby Franks, a 14-year-old boy, had to pay for their attempt at a perfect crime. So, what's the moral here? I guess what any moral for any crime is. The victims and the victims' families are irreparably destroyed. And most than likely, the person who did the crime are caught and punished. The ones that get away, we haven't caught you yet, but we will as a society. So, yeah. Thank you for listening to this episode. Let me know in the comments or on Instagram or anything like that if you liked it, if you liked the script and everything. I know it was a longer script and a more story-driven script. So let me know if you liked it or not, and stay tuned for more episodes. Like I said, we're super excited for what's coming next. And check out the other shows on Artemis Studio with Artemis Studios, Rillaroos, My Son and Me, Experience the Bizarre. So, yeah, thanks for listening.